Hey, so welcome to another video here on Boondock Pastor, and I wanted to talk a little bit about an idea that I had a few weeks ago. So you're all very familiar, obviously, with the world gone mad, and it just seems like things are heating up over the last few days, and lots of panic, lots of craziness, things being shut down. Just a couple days ago, our leadership team here at Evangel in Fort St. John here in this boondock town, we got some new information. I think we started to kind of see a bit more of the picture of what was going on with this pandemic, and so we ended up making the call yesterday to cancel our services on this morning and instead go with a live feed. So everything kind of came together perfectly, so we were able to pull that off because that was the first time. This morning was the first time we've actually recorded and put out there anything that happens in the Sunday morning gathering, and that's a topic for another day. But kind of got forced into it this morning, and I mean, at this point, I'm pretty impressed by the response. We figure our reach tripled based on just interactions with that video. So it's kind of made me think about the live feed, posting things from Sunday morning, and the validity of doing that. I think it's here to stay for us. But that is not what I really want to talk about. What I wanted to talk about is something that a few weeks ago, I was just having my personal time of reflection and just praying, and I had my journal out, and I felt like God dropped an idea in my heart. This was 3 weeks ago, so kind of before it got really crazy here in North America around the coronavirus. And the idea was kind of church without walls, and I wrote it down in my journal. I did some thinking around it, and I envisioned the possibility of every 8 weeks in our church of possibly going, don't come to the church building on that particular Sunday, but we're gonna just meet in houses across the city. And the idea being possibly a live feed for the preach. So there'd still be a preaching aspect that would be put out live to all of those house churches, but then that they would kind of have a worship time together and a prayer time, maybe even looking like a mini prayer summit. We do these things called prayer summits every month, and then finishing up with dinner. And I thought this would be really cool. I really want to see people released into their call as individuals and really take up the mantle of not being consumers that are tethered to a superstar preacher and his support staff, but actually moving in the rhythms of local church in their own world, in their own homes, in their own workplaces. So I had this idea, and I wrote it in my journal as church without walls, and then I got a hold of our tech guy. We have a guy on our staff team that's very techy, and I said, hey, can you line up a dummy round for this, where we would have used the platform Zoom. And I had him schedule it for this coming week, so this next week coming up. Well, as it turns out, all this stuff started happening in BC, British Columbia, around the coronavirus, so we ended up not doing our gatherings. And we're kind of forced into trying that in part this morning, pushing out a feed to our church, and we had an incredible response, high involvement. But here's what I'm noticing. I'm noticing that a lot of churches are doing similar things, and this is good. But I think that we might want to keep this in mind when we transition out of what has been the typical model for our churches in North America, which is basically everybody comes to a big gathering. And in that gathering, there are basically a few people that do most of the work in that gathering. And you usually have a high quality of preaching, you have a high quality of music and all of that. You can call it kind of the mega church model in a way. And what I'm seeing is that it seems like churches are trying to import the mega into this house church thing, or bringing it into the living rooms of people in their churches. And I don't think that's where we want to go on this. I actually think that if this pandemic gets worse and we are forced to walk away from our gatherings, which it seems like that's the way it's going, like it or not, justified or not, that we are quickly getting to the point where you won't be able to gather in groups maybe above 10 or 20. which means the church is going to have to rotate into smaller settings like the house church. And when it does, my advice is that we should take the opportunity to roll into something new versus just import the mega and into the small context. And it doesn't matter if you're a church of 50, 100, or 5,000. What you do on your Sundays typically is mega compared to what's going to happen in somebody's living room with 10 or 20 people. So I think there's an opportunity here to definitely do things a little bit differently. So I want to put that out for thought. The disruptions that we're dealing with right now are very, very good, I think, for us to think creatively and out of the box. And a possibility to kind of move into something that maybe looks a little bit more like the Acts model of the church. Now, I know we don't just want to say we need to go back to the Acts model because they had their issues and problems as well. But there's definitely some really cool things, I think, and I talk about it in Boondock Church. I have a copy of it here. It's the book I wrote not that long ago. And in it, I talk a lot about the model that Paul poses for the local church, and specifically the local church gathering in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. I think that 1 Corinthians 14 is probably the most powerful document text about the local church and how it should work. But you'll notice as soon as you start to read 1 Corinthians 14, which is the only advice we have in Scripture around how to do the gathering, that we're not doing it like that in most churches across North America, and I would say across the planet. It doesn't look like this. So in 1 Corinthians 14, and I break this down chapter by chapter in the book, there are several elements that are in a gathering that Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 14. Read it for yourself and you'll see these things. There's always going to be a time of worship and singing, and that's always an important part of the gathering. And we tried a number of years ago to think, do we really need that there? Or are we just doing it because everybody else does it? No, trust me, without a worship component where you're singing God songs and you're worshiping God, your gathering just slides into mediocrity pretty quick. So in the 1 Core 14 document, what I call 1 Corinthians 14, there's worship, hymns, spiritual songs are being sung. So there's that element. 2, there's the element of learning together, which often comes through a preacher or a teacher or somebody with a prophetic word or a revelation. There's that element. There's very clearly in the 1 Core 14 document a high level of involvement. And this is where I think sometimes we lose this in our typical model of a Sunday morning gathering, especially in the really, really big contexts. And I know there's nothing like gathering a bunch of people together. I love pulling 200 people into our auditorium, 300 people into our auditorium, and having a worship time and getting really psyched up about a talk, But there's very little involvement for most people. It's really a handful of people that are doing all the work and the ministry, and most people are observers, and that amplifies over and over and over again exponentially when you get into bigger settings. Think of a massive passion gathering in Coliseum, 60 to 80,000 people. There's a lot of consumers there, and very few people are actually doing the ministry. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it stands in stark contrast to the 1 Core 14 document, where you see a high level of involvement, and people are bringing a word of wisdom. People are bringing a prophetic revelation, or something they're sensing that Jesus is saying. Another person's bringing a song. Another person's bringing a hymn. There's this level of involvement, and I think we might have an opportunity to try this in. We're being forced out of our big gatherings potentially here in Canada. We have an opportunity to try this in the house model. The other two things in the 1 Core 14 document that I go into extensively in the book are two ideas that kind of are subtext, but the one is this: the voice of Jesus should be heard in the gathering. And so Paul's talking a lot about prophecy. Prophecy is the testimony of Jesus, Revelation 19:10. So basically, whenever you see the word prophecy in 1 Corinthians 14, it's just saying the voice of Jesus should be heard. What he's thinking, what his testimony is, what he's testifying about should be heard. That's the one thing. The second thing is it should be understandable. And the whole document, from start to finish, on Core 14 is about how what's said should be understandable and relevant. So I think we would be maybe doing a bit of a disservice in this season to just import the mega into the house church, or whatever it's going to look like as we kind of move forward in this very, very interesting season the church is in. I think we would be doing a disservice to just import what we do on our gatherings into that. There may be a bit of both and so it's just something to think about. And I guess I'm seeing the relevance of some of the things that I wrote about in Boondock Church, specifically that really a subtext through the whole book is anybody with a sincere heart to follow Jesus can actually be the leader of one of these churches. And so I'm excited about this season we're coming into. I know there's a lot of uncertainty. Everybody's freaking out about, do they have enough toilet paper? Trust me, you'll be fine. This is going to be, I think, the opportunity of the church to embrace something new. So I'll keep talking about that here. I really feel like it's an evolving situation, and we'll know more day by day as we start to flesh this out. But I am really feeling like there's something shifting in the church, and it may be our opportunity to move into some of these things that are taught in Scripture around what the local church can and should look like, and moving away from what have become some of the norms. And honestly, if we're honest about it, they are pretty unproductive norms, not necessarily moving people along the journey of spiritual transformation like we wish and hope they would. So just some thoughts. I'll sign out for now. We'll keep talking. If you haven't already, subscribe below and you'll get notified whenever I throw something up here to Boondock Church. As well, hit that little bell and you'll be notified. So good talking with you. Thanks for tuning in. We'll talk again soon.